3 weeks earlier, David had lost his job, his savings, and nearly his daughter's trust. The bakery had stood empty for 3 years. For David, it represented both the weight of the past and the possibility of a new beginning. Lily didn't fully understand how difficult life had become, but she always seemed to know exactly when her father needed a hug.
For David, this wasn't simply an old building. It was a second chance to rebuild a future for himself and his daughter.
Just as everything finally seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected visitor stepped through the bakery door, the very man who had once ended David's career.
If you've ever felt like the world took everything from you and left nothing but ashes, stay with me until the end, because this story might change the way you see second chances. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's a lot more heart-wrenching, inspiring journeys waiting for you on this channel. Now, let's begin. David Turner had always believed that hard work was enough. For 14 years, he had climbed the corporate ladder at Halstead Marketing Group, starting as a junior copywriter and working his way up to senior brand director. He believed in loyalty. He believed that if you gave a company your best years, your best ideas, your best self, it would give something back. He was wrong. The morning it happened was unremarkable in every way. David had walked into the glass-walled office building in downtown Chicago with a coffee in one hand and a presentation folder in the other, ready to pitch the biggest campaign of his career, a national rebrand for one of Halstead's largest clients. He had spent 6 weeks on it, sacrificing weekends, missing his daughter Lily's school play, staying up until 2 in the morning perfecting slide decks. He believed this project would finally secure the promotion he'd been chasing for years, the one that would let him breathe a little easier, the one that would let him tell Lily they didn't have to worry about money anymore. Instead, at 9:15 a.m, he was called into a conference room on the 40th floor. Sitting at the head of the table was Richard Vance, the CEO of Halstead Marketing Group, a tall man in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed back perfectly, a navy-tailored suit that probably cost more than David's monthly mortgage, and a face that rarely showed emotion unless it was calculated to show emotion. Beside him sat 2 HR representatives, folders open, pens ready. "David," Richard said, not bothering to look up from his tablet, "we've made the decision to restructure the brand division. Your position has been eliminated, effective immediately." David felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Eliminated? Richard, I just finished the Meridian campaign. It's ready to present this morning." "The Meridian campaign will move forward," Richard said flatly. "Just not with you attached to it. Marcus will be taking over your accounts." Marcus was 26 years old and had been at the company for 8 months. David opened his mouth to argue, to ask why, to demand some explanation that made sense. But Richard was already standing, already gathering his things, already treating the conversation as finished. "It's nothing personal," Richard added, almost as an afterthought, as he walked toward the door. "It's just business, nothing personal." As if 14 years of David's life, 14 years of birthdays missed, and anniversaries rescheduled, and sleep sacrificed, could be reduced to 2 dismissive words on his way out of a room. David sat in that conference room alone for nearly 20 minutes after everyone left, staring at the folder in his hands, the one containing 6 weeks of work that would now have someone else's name on it. When he finally stood, he packed his desk into a single cardboard box, 14 years, compressed into one box, and walked out of the building he'd given his life to, into a gray Chicago afternoon that felt colder than it should have for October. Going home was worse. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving David to raise their daughter Lily alone. Lily was 8 years old now, with her mother's curly dark hair and her father's stubborn determination, and she was the only reason David got out of bed some mornings during those first terrible months of grief. That night, David sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had gone to sleep, staring at a stack of bills he'd been avoiding for weeks, and did math that refused to work No matter how many times he ran the numbers, severance would cover 2 months, maybe 3 if he was careful. After that, nothing. The weeks that followed blurred together in a fog of rejection emails and interviews that led nowhere. David applied to over 60 positions. He was either overqualified, not quite the right fit, or simply never heard back at all. The job market for a 42-year-old marketing director, it turned out, was brutally unforgiving. Companies wanted younger, cheaper, hungrier. David felt himself disappearing, piece by piece, into a version of himself he didn't recognize. A man who flinched every time his phone buzzed, hoping it was good news, and was disappointed every single time. Lily noticed, of course. Children always notice more than adults give them credit for. She started leaving little notes on David's desk, crayon drawings of the two of them, hearts scribbled in the corners, messages like, "You're the best dad, even if you're sad." One night, she crawled into his lap while he was staring blankly at his laptop screen, and without saying anything, just hugged him. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply held on, the way only a child who loves unconditionally can hold on, and David broke down crying for the first time since the funeral of her mother. It was during one of his aimless walks through the neighborhood, trying to clear his head, that David first noticed the old building on the corner of Maple and 9th. It had once been Miller's Bakery, a beloved local institution that had closed its doors 3 years earlier when the owner, old Mr. Miller, passed away, with no family to take over the business. The windows were grimy, the wooden sign faded and peeling, a for sale notice taped crookedly to the glass door. David stood there for a long time, staring at the building, remembering how the whole neighborhood used to smell like cinnamon and fresh bread every Saturday morning when Mr. Miller was still alive. David had always loved baking. It had started as a way to bond with his mother as a child, then became a stress relief hobby. During his years in corporate marketing, something he did late at night when the pressure of quarterly reports became too much, Sarah used to joke that his sourdough was better than his PowerPoint presentations. Standing outside that abandoned bakery, something in David shifted. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was grief, looking for somewhere to go. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's laugh when she'd taste his bread. Whatever it was, David walked home that night and, for the first time in weeks, felt something other than despair. The building was cheap. Cheaper than it should have been, honestly. Because nobody wanted a burned-out storefront in a neighborhood that had seen better days. David used almost every penny of his remaining severance and dipped into the small life insurance payout he'd been saving untouched since Sarah's passing, the money he'd sworn he would never spend on anything but Lily's future. It was a terrifying, reckless decision, and he knew it. But for the first time since losing his job, David felt like he was choosing something instead of having something taken from him. The early days of renovation were brutal. David spent his days ripping out rotted shelving, scrubbing 3 years of grime off tile floors, and learning, through painful trial and error, and countless YouTube tutorials, how to fix a broken commercial oven with a rented toolkit and sheer stubbornness. Lily would come after school and sit on an overturned bucket, doing her homework while David worked, occasionally handing him tools like a tiny, dedicated assistant. Those afternoons, covered in dust and sawdust, became some of the most meaningful time David had spent with his daughter in years. There was no phone buzzing with bad news. There was just the two of them, and a building slowly coming back to life. Money remained a constant, gnawing worry. David sold his car and bought an old, reliable used pickup truck instead, pocketing the difference for supplies. He negotiated with suppliers, begging for extended payment terms. He taught himself bookkeeping late at night after Lily fell asleep, determined not to make the same financial mistakes that had crushed other failed small businesses in the neighborhood. Slowly, painstakingly, the bakery began to take shape. He repainted the sign himself, not Miller's Bakery anymore, but Second Chance Bakery, a name that felt more honest than anything else he could have chosen. The grand opening was small and quiet. David had no money for advertising, so he relied on word of mouth, handmade flyers, and the goodwill of neighbors who remembered Mr. Miller fondly and were curious about who had taken over the space. The first morning, David woke up at 4 a.m., his hands shaking, as he mixed dough in the dim light of the kitchen, terrified that nobody would come, terrified that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, terrified he'd failed Lily the way he felt he'd failed Sarah by not being able to save her. But people came, slowly, at first. An elderly woman who used to buy bread from Mr. Miller every Sunday. A group of construction workers drawn in by the smell of fresh croissants. A young mother with a stroller who became a regular within the first week. David poured everything he had into that bakery. He experimented with recipes late into the night. He remembered customers' names and orders. He gave day-old bread to the shelter down the street, rather than throwing it away. Slowly, the neighborhood began to fall in love with Second Chance Bakery, the same way they'd once loved Miller's. 6 months in, the bakery was breaking even. 8 months in, it was turning a small but real profit. David allowed himself, for the first time in nearly a year, to breathe. Lily had taken to helping out on weekends, proudly wearing a tiny apron David had specially made for her, greeting customers with the same warmth her mother once had. The bakery had become more than a business. It had become a home, a community, a place where David had rebuilt not just his finances, but his sense of who he was. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nearly a year after the firing, that the bell above the door chimed, and everything changed. David was behind the counter, arranging a fresh tray of cinnamon rolls, when he glanced up out of habit to greet the incoming customer, and felt his entire body go cold. Standing in the doorway, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, sunglasses pushed up into perfectly combed silver hair, was Richard Vance. For a moment, neither man spoke. Richard's eyes swept across the bakery, the warm lighting, the chalkboard menu, the small crowd of satisfied regulars, the framed photo behind the counter of David and Lily on opening day, before finally landing on David's face. Something flickered across Richard's expression. Surprise, maybe even discomfort. Quickly, masked behind the same practiced neutrality David remembered from that conference room a year and Mummer. David, Richard said slowly. I didn't expect this. David set down the tray, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron, forcing his voice to stay steady. Neither did I, once. Richard glanced around again, taking in the details. The hand-lettered menu boards, the community bulletin board, covered in flyers for local events, the little corner where Lily did her homework after school. This is yours? Every brick of it, David said. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. A young couple at a nearby table glanced over, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. I'm in the neighborhood for a property inspection. Halstead is looking at some commercial real estate for a new satellite office. I didn't realize this street had changed so much. David almost laughed at the absurdity of it. That Richard's presence wasn't fate or reckoning, just coincidence, just business. The same phrase Richard had used to dismiss David's entire career a year earlier. It's nothing personal. It's just business. Can I get you something? David asked, falling back on the instinct of hospitality that had carried him through the hardest year of his life. Coffee? Something from the case? Richard looked almost startled by the offer, as though he'd expected anger, maybe even hostility, and hadn't prepared for simple decency. Sure, coffee would be fine. As David poured the coffee, Lily came bursting in from the back room, cheeks flushed from running, and stopped short at the sight of the stranger in the expensive suit. Dad, is everything okay? She asked, immediately sensing the strange energy in the room, moving protectively closer to her father's side. Everything's fine, sweetheart, David said gently, resting a hand on her shoulder. This is Mr. Vance. He used to be my boss. Richard looked down at Lily, and something in his face genuinely softened. Maybe the sight of a child so instinctively protective of her father reminded him of something he'd lost or forgotten in his own climb to the top. "You have a very nice bakery," he told her. "My dad built it from nothing," Lily said, with the fierce pride only a child can carry. "He lost his job, but he didn't give up." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked back at David. "I heard the market was rough for marketing directors your age. I didn't realize how rough." "It was," David said simply. No bitterness in his voice, only fact. "But I think losing that job was the best thing that ever happened to me." Richard studied him for a long moment, coffee cup halfway to his lips, as if trying to reconcile the exhausted, defeated man he remembered firing with the calm, grounded person now standing in front of him, clearly thriving, clearly happy, clearly surrounded by a community he had built with his own 2 hands. "The restructuring," Richard said quietly, almost like a confession, "wasn't entirely about performance. The board wanted to cut costs, and senior salaries were the easiest target. Marcus was cheaper. I should have fought harder for you. I didn't." David felt something in his chest loosen, some tight, resentful knot he hadn't realized he was still carrying. He hadn't needed the apology. He'd already found peace without it, but hearing it still mattered. "I appreciate you saying that," David said. "But honestly, Richard, I don't need it anymore. I used to think that job was the only thing keeping my life together. Turns out, it was actually holding me back from finding out what I was really capable of." Richard glanced around the bakery once more, at the warmth of the place, the laughter of customers, the little girl who so clearly adored her father, the life David had, built out of the wreckage Richard himself had helped create. And for the first time since David had known him, Richard Vance looked almost envious. "Would you ever consider consulting?" Richard asked suddenly. "Halstead could use someone who understands branding the way you do. Someone who builds things that actually mean something to people, not just quarterly numbers." David smiled, genuinely, without a trace of resentment. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I've already found the only branding project I ever really wanted to work on." He gestured around the bakery, at Lily now happily restocking napkins at the counter, at the customers chatting warmly with one another over coffee and pastries. "This is it." Richard nodded slowly, seeming to understand something he perhaps hadn't fully grasped before. He paid for his coffee, insisting on it despite David's cardist, and left a business card on the counter. "If you ever change your mind," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, added, "This is a good place, David. You should be proud." "I am," David said, and for the first time in over a year, he truly meant it, with no hesitation, no fear, no doubt clouding the words. After Richard left, David stood behind the counter for a long moment, watching through the window as his former boss's car pulled away down the street. Lily came up beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked. David looked down at her, then around at the bakery filled with the smell of fresh bread and the warm chatter of neighbors who had become something like family, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the failure that had forced him to rebuild, for the daughter who had never once stopped believing in him, for the second chance he almost hadn't dared to take. "I'm more than okay," he said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." In the months that followed, Second Chance Bakery continued to grow. David expanded the menu, hired his first employee, a young woman named Teresa, who had also been struggling to find work after a difficult year, and started a program giving free pastries to anyone in the neighborhood facing hardship, a quiet way of paying forward the second chance he himself had been given. The bakery became not just a business, but a symbol, a reminder to everyone in the community that losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself. David never did take Richard up on the consulting offer. He didn't need to. He had already found what he'd spent 14 years searching for in corporate boardrooms and quarterly presentations. Not in a title, not in a salary, not in anyone else's approval, but in the simple, honest work of building something real with his own 2 hands, for his daughter, for his community, for himself. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you turns out to be the door to the life you were always meant to live. David Turner didn't just survive losing everything. He rose from it, one loaf of bread at a time, and in doing so, he taught his daughter, and everyone, whoever walked through the doors of Second Chance Bakery, that it's never too late to begin again. If this story touched you even a little, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about resilience, second chances, and the quiet power of never giving up. Thank you for watching until the very end.